Wow, you look absolutely beautiful.
Thank you so much. Come right on in. I was just getting everything ready.
The last person I expected to see standing on my parents' porch was the woman I had spent 3 years trying to forget. But when I opened the front door that Sunday afternoon and saw Rachel standing there with tears in her eyes, my heart seemed to forget how to beat. She looked older than I remembered, not because she had changed badly, but because life had clearly asked more of her than it had when we last said goodbye. She looked at me for several seconds before quietly saying, "Your dad told me you were still single." I had to come. I didn't understand what she meant. I didn't know that my father had made a phone call weeks earlier that would bring an unfinished chapter of my life back to my doorstep. And I certainly didn't know that Rachel had come carrying a truth that would change the way I understood love, regret, and second chances forever. Before we go any further, if you believe that kindness can heal old wounds, that hope can find people in their darkest seasons, and that forgiveness and second chances can change a life, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes a simple story can remind us that the people we think are gone forever may still have something meaningful left to say. My name is Caleb, and I was 34 years old when Rachel came back into my life. I lived in a quiet town outside Asheville, North Carolina, where I worked as a restoration carpenter. I repaired old homes, rebuilt wooden staircases, restored damaged floors, and spent most of my days surrounded by things that had already lived one life and were waiting for someone to believe they could have another. Maybe that was why my father always said I was strangely good at fixing broken things. The truth was, I was much better at repairing old houses than repairing my own heart. 3 years earlier, Rachel and I had been engaged. We had planned a small wedding in the spring, saved for a modest house, and talked about having a family someday. But 6 weeks before our wedding, everything changed. Rachel's mother became seriously ill, and Rachel decided she needed to move to Ohio to care for her. I told her I understood. I told her we could wait. But over the following months, our calls became shorter, our conversations became harder, and the distance between us slowly became more than physical. One evening, after another difficult conversation, Rachel told me she couldn't promise when she would return or whether she could still be the person I wanted her to be. I took those words as a goodbye. Instead of asking her to stay, I let my pride speak for me. I told her that if she didn't know whether she wanted a future with me, then I couldn't keep waiting. She cried. I stayed silent. She left the next morning, and I never called her again. My father, Thomas, never approved of the way things ended. He believed I had confused heartbreak with strength. For years afterward, whenever he mentioned Rachel, I changed the subject. Eventually, he stopped mentioning her altogether. Then, one rainy Sunday, Rachel appeared at the house. I couldn't move. She stood beneath the porch light holding a small brown envelope against her chest. My father was behind me in the hallway, and when I turned toward him, I saw something in his face that made my stomach tighten. He wasn't surprised. "You knew she was coming," I said. My father lowered his eyes. He admitted that several weeks earlier, he had spoken with Rachel's older brother, Nathan, after meeting him at a community fundraiser. Nathan had told him that Rachel's mother had passed away peacefully the previous winter. My father had offered his condolences, and somehow the conversation had turned toward me. Nathan had asked whether I had ever married. My father had answered honestly. No, he had told him. Caleb is still single. Rachel had apparently heard about that conversation later. But that wasn't the reason she had come. She stepped inside, looked around the house, and smiled sadly at the familiar photographs on the wall. Then she handed me the envelope. Inside was a small photograph of my mother, who had passed away years earlier, standing beside Rachel at my parents' kitchen table. On the back, my mother had written something in blue ink. "Some people are worth finding your way back to." I stared at those words until they blurred. Rachel explained that she had found the photograph while helping her mother organize old belongings. Her mother had kept it all those years. Along with it was a letter my mother had written to Rachel shortly before her illness became serious. Rachel had never received it. In the letter, my mother had written that she knew Rachel loved me, but she also knew that love sometimes required patience rather than possession. She told Rachel that if life ever separated us, she hoped neither of us would mistake distance for the end of love. I didn't know what to say. Rachel sat across from me at the kitchen table where we had once spent countless evenings talking about our future. She told me about the years in Ohio. She told me about caring for her mother, the exhaustion, the loneliness, and the guilt she carried after leaving me. She admitted that she had wanted to call me hundreds of times, but every time she reached for her phone, she remembered my final words. She thought I had moved on. I told her I hadn't. For the first time in 3 years, I admitted something I had been too proud to say aloud. I hadn't dated because I was secretly comparing everyone to her. I had convinced myself I was simply busy with work, but the truth was that I had built a comfortable life around an empty space. Rachel began to cry. But she didn't ask me to take her back. Instead, she said something that changed everything. I didn't come here to ask you to forget what happened. I came to apologize for the way I left you. And I came to tell you that I finally understand what I was too afraid to say back then. I looked at her. She took a breath and said that she had never stopped loving me. The words hurt more than they comforted me because love wasn't the only thing that had survived those 3 years. So had the pain. I told her that I still loved her too, but that love alone couldn't erase what had happened. We had both changed. We couldn't simply reopen the past and pretend nothing had happened. She nodded. Then she said, I know. That's why I'm not asking for yesterday. I'm asking if we can start with tomorrow. Those words stayed with me. She didn't demand forgiveness. She didn't expect a miracle. She simply asked for a chance to rebuild trust slowly. For the next several weeks, Rachel stayed in town while helping settle the final details of her mother's estate. We began meeting for coffee. Then walks. Then dinner with my parents. There were awkward moments, painful memories, and conversations we should have had years earlier. I learned that Rachel had become stronger. She learned that I had become softer. One evening, while we were walking through a local park, she asked whether I still had the old wooden box where I kept our wedding plans. I laughed and told her I had thrown it away. She smiled and said she was glad. Why? Because if we're ever going to build something again, she said, I don't want to rebuild the old version. That was when I finally understood. We weren't getting back together. We were meeting each other again. Months passed. Rachel accepted a position with a nonprofit organization in Asheville, working with families who needed help rebuilding their lives after difficult circumstances. I continued restoring houses, but something inside me had changed. I no longer looked at damaged things as reminders of what had been lost. I began seeing them as evidence that brokenness wasn't always the end of a story. One Saturday morning, my father called me into his workshop. He handed me a small wooden box. Inside were 2 old wedding rings. I stared at him in disbelief. He smiled and told me he had kept them because he had never been convinced our story was finished. But then he shook his head and added that whether Rachel and I married or never saw each other again, he wanted me to understand something. Your mother and I weren't perfect, he said. We just learned that love isn't about finding someone who never disappoints you. It's about finding someone willing to grow with you. A year after Rachel first returned, we stood on a quiet mountain overlook just outside Asheville. There were no decorations, no crowd, and no elaborate ceremony. Just my parents, her brother Nathan, a few close friends, and the evening sky turning gold beyond the trees. Rachel wasn't wearing the old engagement ring. Neither was I. Instead, we had chosen new rings. Not because the past didn't matter, but because we had finally stopped trying to live inside it. When I looked at her, I realized something I wish I had understood 3 years earlier. Sometimes people don't come back because the past was perfect. Sometimes they come back because both people have finally become ready to do what they couldn't do before. And sometimes the greatest second chance isn't getting back what you lost. It's becoming the kind of person who knows how to love it properly when it returns. If this story touched something inside your heart, please don't just watch and move on. Leave a like, share this story with someone who believes that people can change, and subscribe if you want more stories about hope, compassion, forgiveness, and unexpected second chances. And before the story ends, I want to ask you something special. In the comments, write, "Second chances matter," if you believe that some relationships deserve another opportunity when both people are willing to grow, forgive, and begin again. Your comment might be exactly what someone struggling with an old regret needs to see today. As Rachel and I stood together beneath the fading mountain light, my father watched from a distance with tears in his eyes. Later, he told me that when he said I was still single, he hadn't known what would happen. He had simply answered a question honestly. But sometimes, the smallest truth can open a door that pride once closed. Rachel reached for my hand. I held it. And for the first time, neither of us was holding on to the past. We were holding on to each other. Sometimes love doesn't return wearing the same face it had before. Sometimes it comes back wiser, quieter, and more humble. And sometimes, when life gives you a second chance, the bravest thing you can do is open the door and see what happens next.